So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yuxiao Hu, and I'm from LSE. And first of all, thank you so much for our great organizers for making that happen, and also for providing me with this opportunity. And thank you for your presence, especially in the lunchtime. I'll be very quick. So, as you can see from the title, the title is Sacrifice for the Greater Good, Flood Detention Basins in China. This is a co-author work with Yifan, who is an incoming PhD here. As you can see from this title, I'm going to talk about flood, which is a type of natural disasters. So thinking about natural disasters, for example, earthquakes, storms, hurricanes, and floods, they are all terrible in different forms, but they have one thing in common. That is, natural disasters have uneven impacts on regions. Some regions will be affected more severely than other regions. And similarly, when we talk about environmental projects, we find that they can also have uneven impacts. For example, according to Duflo and Pan's work, they find that dam construction will have different impacts on upstream and downstream regions in India. So, if we want to design policies to manage natural disasters, we need to consider two key aspects. First of all, inequality. Does the policy have different impacts on different regions? It could be the policy brings different benefits, different levels of benefits to different regions. It could also be the policy is benefiting some regions but harming other regions. Second key aspect, welfare. Does the policy bring a net welfare gain to the society, thus improving the economic resilience of the society towards disasters? Thinking about those two key questions, especially in an era of more and more disasters, we focus on China's flood detention basin policy. China is a country with severe flood risk. In terms of number of river flood events, China ranks #1. And the flood damage in China occupies 7% worldwide. And that is because, as you can see from those two comparisons, the region, that red region with a severe flood risk in China is also more economically important because the nighttime light intensity is also higher in that region. And that is why China suffers from a substantial flood damage. And that is also why China is using a flood detention basin policy to address flood risk. As you can see from this picture, this is a picture of a flood detention basin county in China. There is a dam. So Chinese government is using this dam to divert flood water into the low-lying land. As you can see from this graphical illustration, this dam is located in a low-lying land, so that when flood water comes from like a higher place, the flood water can be diverted using this dam to low-lying land county. The consequence, however, is that all agricultural crops and factories will be fully inundated in those flood detention basin county. So for now, maybe you feel that it is not very surprising because we're talking about a highly disruptive natural disaster, which is flood. So when things get really severe, people need to find a way to solve that issue. So some regions, unfortunately, have to bear more cost. What I find surprising about the China study is that Chinese government is bringing in an intentional flood risk redistribution by raising up the flood risk in flood detention basin counties to protect a broader region. So in 2000, Chinese government officially designated 96 counties as flood detention basin counties. So the Chinese government is not making decisions when the flood water comes. Instead, they are making decisions before the flood water comes. And that way, there will be an intentional flood risk redistribution across regions. And we also need to note that China is a highly populated country, meaning that a lot of people will be affected by that. How many? 15 million residents will be affected. So I would consider that as a unique and also a large-scale flood risk management policy. This policy is also frequently used. The Chinese government has diverted flood water into those flood detention basin counties for more than 100 times since 2000. And according to Chinese media, there is an embedded spirit of sacrificing me or the 96 FDB counties for the whole society. Based on this policy setting, we really want to understand what is the welfare and distributional impacts of the FDB policy in China. Specifically, we are interested in two questions. First of all, what is the economic cost on FDB counties? Or to what extent did they sacrifice because of the policy? And secondly, we want to understand, does the policy increase the overall welfare and thus improving the society's resilience towards flood in China? Before delving into more details, I would like to give you short answers to those questions. First one, based on our identification, we find that this policy caused a $13 billion loss in annual real GDP in all FDB counties. So that is around $85 per person in those counties. We're talking about basically rural residents in a developing country. So that is a large number. And secondly, in terms of the overall welfare gain, according to our general equilibrium model, we find that this policy increased the net output gain of around $10 billion in Hua River Basin. We're still working in progress, so we're focusing on a river basin with the most severe flood risk in China. To make it to make a comparison, the cost on Hua River Basin is around $4 billion. So our preliminary conclusion to the question sacrifice for the greater good would be, yes, FDB policy is causing FDB counties to sacrifice, but also this policy increases the overall welfare gain in the society. Okay, yeah.
In these numbers, do you take into account
that is real GDP.
you take into account the cost in terms of human lives lost?
Actually, we're using nighttime light intensity. So we're basically measuring GDP loss. We're not measuring like human lives loss. We're not measuring that. Okay, let me continue. Now, let me talk about data sources before I go to empirical results. All of our data are like annual data, mostly are like county level data. List of flood detention basins are collected from 2000 and 2010 government policy by Ministry of Water Resources. We have nighttime light intensity data. We just use the original satellite data and construct like the county level annual nighttime light intensity for each county. We have county level manufacturing output and number of manufacturing firms. We have firm level data on fixed asset investments, and we can, using the geolocated code, we can map those counties, those firms into different counties. We have the number of firm entry in different county in different years, and also our flood data is coming from the global flood database. According to that database, we have data on the average number of flooded days experienced by each pixel in a map, so that we can construct a flood risk proxy to measure the average number of flooded days experienced by a county in a year. So that is our flood risk proxy. Based on that flood risk proxy, we're able to find out that flood risk in FDB counties is around 10% higher than other counties after we controlling for different geographical controls. In other words, that is to say the Chinese government is successful in redistributing flood risk across regions. And that kind of gives us the foundation to ask the further question, which is, then what about the cost? To identify the costs on FDB counties, we rely on two policy changes. The first one is a major policy change that in 2000, Chinese government pre-designated 96 counties as FDB counties. The second policy change happened in 2010. At that time, Chinese government newly selected 20 counties into the list because they want to protect a major city like Nanjing in China. They also removed 10 FDB counties from the list because some counties are kind of like never used for flood water detention. we are faced with a key identification challenge. That is, the selection may be non-random. Although according to our empirical result, we find that elevation, which is the geographical factor, is the major influencing factor. We still cannot exclude any other like possibilities. And that is why we rely on synthetic difference in difference, which is the combination of synthetic control and difference in difference proposed by R. Hangelski. And secondly, we use spatial regression discontinuity by Gelman and Evans so that we can compare firm activities of firms located in FDB counties with firms located in neighboring non-FDB counties. We also use like traditional DID and IV, but we don't have time to present that. So that is how we identify the cost. And now let me show you the major results we have regarding the cost. We focus on nighttime light intensity, and as you can see from the figure to the left, the treated group here will be the 96 FDB counties selected into the list in 2000. And we could see that after the policy implementation, nighttime light intensities immediately dropped in those counties, and the impact is kind of like persistent more than 10 years. And in terms of the magnitude, that is around 9%. 9% drop in nighttime light intensity.
I'm sorry, if I understand it correctly, so this is just the effect of being designated an FTB county.
Yeah.
So this is like people leaving out or people making decisions that, okay, it's no longer worthwhile to live here.
No, we're just looking at the policy impact of FDB policy.
Right. So that means that it's an effect of people deciding to move out, not the effect of the flood itself.
So we're not focusing on people's migration decisions. Here, our outcome variable is nighttime light intensity. So we're kind of like to see what changes brought to nighttime light intensity because of the policy. If we want to focus on migrations, then we need to change other outcome variables.
I understand that, but why is there a change in nighttime light intensity? What is the reason for the change?
Oh, I will talk about that later. That will be because of firms. So probably we can discuss that when I reach that. Yeah. So the magnitude is 9%. Then I use Henderson's work to translate that 9% in light to around 3% drop in GDP. And that will be around $13 billion decrease in annual GDP in FDB counties because of the policy. So that is a substantial economic cost bared by those FDB counties. And if we focus on like the 2010 policy change, that is kind of like a similar result. Then we look at manufacturing and we find, okay, a 20% decrease in manufacturing output. Then let's go back to that question, which is, what is the mechanism? Okay, so the Chinese government is claiming that the FDB counties are making sacrifices because of direct inundation during flood events, but we believe that is not the whole story here. There is a hidden cost. This hidden cost is generated from the so-called firm response effect, that firms are less willing to enter and invest in those regions. And that way, FDB counties are not receiving the benefit of structural transformation from agricultural to manufacturing. We're not saying that this is the only mechanism here, but we are more interested in this mechanism because we're more interested in economic outcomes. And also we have better data on firms. If our guess or like if our hypothesis, if our thoughts about the mechanism is correct, then we probably can observe two things. First of all, when a county is selected into the list, then less firms will enter into that county. And secondly, if a firm is being removed from the list, then probably firms will start to re-enter. Because of the 2010 policy change, we're able to empirically test it, because 20 new counties were added into the list and 10 were removed from it. Okay. So now let me use one outcome variable to show that. As you can see here, the figure to the left is the impact of being selected into the list, and the figure to the right is the impact of being removed from the list. Those two results are kind of like symmetric. So that is to say, being selected into the list tends to decrease the number of manufacturing firms, and being removed from the list tend to increase the manufacturing firms. the number of
A
manufacturers.
question on the interpretation.
Yeah.
Like I totally buy your estimates, but the interpretation could also be a bit different if you think about like investment subsidies that may no longer be going to those places or things like that. I understand that like the Chinese government probably doesn't designate a place like in this way and then also continues to spend the same amount of money.
So that is more about like selection issue, like Chinese government are selecting poorly developed regions and they don't want to give incentives, investment incentives, and that is why they chose them. But according to our empirical result, elevation is the major influencing factor here. And also that is why we are using synthetic difference in difference instead of like fixed effects regression to kind of exclude that threat of exogenized.
But I think it would perhaps be nice to look at like actual like subsidies going to those regions, whether that responds or like actual government policy in those regions, whether that's different, because otherwise it would be like a little bit of a weird policy if that didn't happen, like if they continue to invest in those places.
Yeah, so we're talking about like China, a developing country setting. So they are not receiving enough compensation or like subsidy because of that policy. And that also happens in India, because when I read Duflo's work on dam construction, the India government is not compensating enough to like those India regions who suffered from the dam construction. Okay, so that is more results we have, and those are all symmetric.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, I just wonder, like, if a region is removed from the list, what would be the reason? If the main reason of the designation is mainly the elevation, like, it doesn't really mean that this reason becomes lower or higher as time goes by.
Yeah, that is another question regarding like the selection. So we studied the 10 FDB counties being removed from the list, and we think that is mainly because they are not very frequently used for floodwater diversion. Basically, they have never been used for floodwater diversion. So I guess that is the reason why they are removed from the list.
So they're making reassessment like each year and then like change their release.
Not each year, only happened like 2 years, 2000 and 2010. 2010, they only make that change. Okay, so that is another regression result, like based on spatial regression discontinuity. We see that firms tend to invest less in fixed assets in FDB counties, and there's a drop here. We use another way to test it, which is a dynamic spatial regression discontinuity. We see that the negative gap only happened after the policy implementation in 2010. Then because of time, let me go to the next important question, which is about welfare. The FDB policy intrinsically has general equilibrium effect and may lead to reallocation of capital. In our model, we have 3 types of counties: FDB counties, were sacrificed counties, protected counties, and never treated counties. And we allow flow of people, flow of goods, and flow of capital. In our counterfactual practice, we're adjusting the flood risk in FDB counties and in protected counties. So our major challenge here is that we don't have an official protection list, and we're still working on that to identify which counties are protected by the list. For now, we're using 2 criteria. The first one is the neighboring and downstream regions. We will identify them as protected counties. And secondly, we read the flood detention basin policy document and try to infer which counties are protected by the Chinese government. Okay, so I will, and as you can see here, protected counties, according to our list, suffer 10% less in flood events. So there's kind of like a direct protection effect, but we are more interested in kind of like an indirect protection effect. That is because of their flood risk is lower, more people tend to invest in their regions. And in our counterfactual practice, we distribute 50% of the flood risk in FDB counties to protected counties. That number is from a water journal. So as you can see here, like regions like that one will have a higher flood risk because of the redistribution in our counterfactual scenario. Finally, we are able to quantify the overall welfare effect of around 0.06% increase. That is a small magnitude. probably. But if we translate that to like the absolute value, that would be $10 billion. And now let me give you a benchmark to make a comparison. The average annual flood damage in China is around $8 billion. So I would not say that is a small magnitude in terms of the policy impact. What I want to say about the major takeaway is about the policy implication. We're now living in the era of like a lot of disasters. So we hope our research can help people to understand the costs and benefits if the government wants to implement a policy that introduces risk redistribution across regions. For one country I'm thinking about is probably India, because India also has like a very high flood risk and also suffers from a great flood damage. But I'm not very sure about their policy, whether they have policy. I don't think they have such kind of policy, but probably one day if they think about that, that will be a good example for them to assess the
It's
cost
a
and benefit.
democracy, though.
Yeah, it is also
You can't do
democracy.
stuff like that.
Yeah, I agree. But that kind of reminds me of COVID because at the very beginning, China does like lockdown, but when things got really severe, a lot of countries just follow the lockdown policy. We're not like in a very, yeah. Thank you so much.